this week we're going to learn about fractional reserve banking and how that can impact the money supply. So hopefully after this you'll have a pretty full picture of how money supply management works with the Fed and how the Fed interacts with banks. So the first question's here: what is a bank? How do you create a bank? And what are a banker's goals? A bank is a business, and it is in the business of essentially earning money off of money. So how do you create a bank? Well, anyone who can get a charter from either state or federal government can create a bank, and it's like starting another business. You would need initial investors who would buy in, and you would issue them stock certificates, and then that would give you the money to basically, build the building, build your vault, and all those pieces, hire some employees, and then you would start taking deposits and making loans. And the banker's goals, of course, like any business, the banker's goal is profit. But the banker earns profit not by selling goods and services, but by earning interest off of the money that people are essentially trusting the banker to take care of. So the banker actually has two goals. One goal is profit and the other is liquidity. So the banker earns money. If you deposit money at a bank, the banker will keep some of that money and use some of that money to make loans to other people. And the interest that they earn on those loans is what gives them profit. So they need to be able to make loans in order to make profit, but they also need to be able to keep some of the money on hand so that when the customers come back in to get the money, that money's available. So those two goals make it very challenging for bankers because the goals are at cross purposes. The more profit you want to earn, the less money you're going to keep as cash in the bank, which means you're less liquid. The more liquid you are, the less profit you're likely to earn. So playing it safe as a bank, right, would mean not making any loans and not making any profit. So a few banking terms. We've talked already about the reserve requirement, and that is what the Fed, actually it's the parameters for the reserve requirement are set by Congress, but then the Federal Reserve actually sets the actual reserve requirement. So the Fed will say something like, banks, you have to keep 10% of checkable deposits on hand. And they could change that to 15% or 12% or put it down to 8%. They couldn't make it completely crazy like 50% without congressional approval. But the Fed can set the reserve requirement, and that is the percentage of checkable deposits or the percentage of money that people have in their checking accounts that the bank has to keep on hand. And the bank, by on hand, there are two places where the bank can keep that money. One place is in the vault, okay, and the second place is on deposit at the Fed. Okay, so when you have required reserves, that would be the money that you are keeping either at the vault or in the Fed. So the reserve requirement tells banks the percentage of checkable deposits banks have to keep. Required reserves is the actual dollar amount that banks have to keep. So those terms sound very similar, but one of them is a percentage and one of them is a dollar amount. And you calculate required reserves by applying the reserve requirement to the total amount of checkable deposits that a bank has. So if the reserve requirement is 10% and the bank has $500,000 in checkable deposits, you should be able to calculate the required reserves. The required reserves are 10% of that, so they are $50,000. And usually the math that you'll do on these tests is relatively easy. Total reserves is the actual amount of reserves that the bank has if you add up what's in the vault and what's at the Fed. And required reserves may, as I just gave you an example, required reserves might be $50,000. Total reserves could be any amount greater than or equal to $50,000. So they have to have at least $50,000, but total reserves might, in fact, turn out to be $80,000. Okay, bank might have required reserves of $50,000, have total reserves of $80,000, and in that case, the bank would be carrying what we call excess reserves, which means they're hanging on to some cash in the vault that they don't need to keep. Okay, they might be doing it because they're more concerned about liquidity right now. They might be doing it because of the banking crisis, and they're concerned about losing money or customers coming in. So there are a number of reasons why a bank might keep excess reserves. They're pretty easy to calculate. Just take total and subtract required. Okay, so when a bank is created, and I just came up with Rush Bank to make it easy, they have what's called a bank balance sheet or a T account. And you can see why it's called a T account because it looks like a T. It's a balance sheet because the two sides have to balance. So we're only going to do a brief introduction to this concept of a T account. Assets are anything the bank has that's of value, and liabilities are what the bank owes to others. And so on this simple T account or simple ledger, We are not going to include things like interest payments. We're not going to see profit. Okay, this is going to be a very simple assets and liabilities sheet. It's not a cash flow statement, it's not an income statement. So when the bank is created, let's say that the bank issues shares of stock to all of the initial investors, and the bank has, let's say, $100,000 in initial deposits. It's not very much. We're going to make this a really low rate bank. They also have liabilities. So they have cash of $100,000 that the initial investors put up, but they have stock, right, or equity shares owed to the shareholders with a value of $100,000 because those people have put their money into the bank. They didn't physically put it into like a savings account or checking account, but they gave the money to the founder of the bank, which is me, and I gave them shares of stock, and I have their cash. So I might take their cash and decide to build a building, and we're living in a very cheap town, okay, so I'm going to, for example, build a building for $90,000, okay, so now I own a $90,000 building, but I no longer have $100,000 in cash, right? Now I have $10,000 in cash. So I have $10,000 in cash, $90,000 in a building, still have $100,000 in stock, so it balances. When people come to put money in the bank and make deposits, what happens is, let's say we have people make $30,000 worth of deposits. So we have deposits in, we're going to say in checking accounts. So we have checkable deposits of $30,000. That's an asset to my bank because I actually have the cash, right? It's actually in the accounts. It's in the vault. But it's also a liability because checkable deposits are owed to the people who put them in there, right? That's their money. It's not my money. And if they come back and want it, they get it. So checkable deposits become both an asset to me and a liability. I owe that money to the depositors, but I have the cash. So checkable deposits are $30,000. If we have a 10% reserve requirement, I now have required reserves of $3,000, excess reserves of $20,000. I just want to make note of that I have excess reserves of $27,000. And what I can do is I can make a loan in the amount of my excess reserves. So let's say I want to lend $27,000 to somebody. How is that going to fit on here? The loan, okay, the loan is actually going to become an asset to me. Okay, I am going to make a loan of $27,000. Okay, but what happens to the cash that I have on hand? And I actually should have, instead of calling this checkable deposits, I should have called it cash here. Okay, this was additional cash. So I had $30,000 plus $10,000 in cash. Now that I've made the loan for $27,000, right, I am not going to have that cash anymore. So I now have a loan, but I only have $3,000 in cash. Am I meeting my reserve requirement? Yes. Okay, so basically that's a very, very, very shorthand. One way to look at it, though, also, is that we can also say that when I actually make the loan, rather than taking it out of cash, a lot of times the way it's shown in books is when I make the loan, okay, we had, sorry, I messed up here. I'm going to make the total cash here after the checkable deposits. Let me go back and change this. So after the total checkable deposits, I have the $10,000 plus the $30,000. So now my cash is $40,000. Okay, when I make a loan, okay, when I make a loan for $27,000, the loan is an asset to me. And instead of taking the money in cash, the person might have it deposited in their checking account. So if I put the money in the person's checking account, now checkable deposits goes up to $57,000, right? If that's what happens, if the person doesn't take the money as cash, but they have it put in their checking account, then I have actually created new money with the loan. Okay, you can see that my cash did not go down, that I now have a loan as an asset, and there's checkable deposits increased on the right. And this, by making loans, this is how banks actually can create money. If we have just one bank, that bank can create loans in the amount of its excess reserves. In other words, that bank can create money in the amount of its excess reserves. So in order to figure out how much money an individual bank can create, you figure out how much they have in checkable deposits, you calculate the required reserves, you look at the total reserves, take total reserves minus required reserves, and then you are able to figure out how much that bank can create. the entire banking system can create quite a bit more. Because if you look at this, Bank A has $100,000 in reserves and deposits, okay? And if the required reserves are, if it's 20% reserve requirement, so their required reserves, I'm sorry, this isn't 100,000, this is just $100, okay? The required reserves are 20, they have excess reserves of 80, they can lend 80, and somebody borrows 80, and that money gets deposited in a second bank, then that money can go through that process again. So the second bank only has to keep $16, it can lend $64, and it goes through that process again. So if you have one bank can lend the amount of its excess reserves. But multiple banks, or an entire banking system, can lend in the amount of excess reserves times the money multiplier, which is 1 over the reserve requirement. So when you have multiple banks, you can actually have quite a bit more money creation going on than with just one bank. And you can see down here, sorry, I gotta move this, that with multiple banks, $100 in additional deposits can result in $400 in money creation. So banks play a really huge role in money creation, and the Fed counts on them to actually create money when they make loans. So again, here's another way of looking at it. $100 initial deposit results in $20 of additional required reserves, but $80 of excess reserves. Here we're basing this on a reserve requirement of 0.2, so a multiplier of 5. Those excess reserves can create new lending of $400. So an additional deposit of $100 becomes $400 with bank system lending. Oops. Okay, so again, with multiple banks, calculate excess reserves of the first bank, calculate the money multiplier, and then that will tell you the total amount the banking system can create. What impact does a fractional reserve banking system have? Well, it means that banks can create a lot of money, right? And the lower the reserve requirement, the more money they can create. What are the leakages from the system? There's two principal leakages. One is that people might take their money as cash, in which case no money is created. The second is that banks might hold on to their excess reserves rather than lend them. How do those impact the system? They reduce the power of the multiplier. They reduce the actual money supply. Number 4, why did banks behave in a pro-cyclical manner during the Depression? That means that when the Depression was going on and people essentially weren't spending money and needed to be encouraged to spend money, banks instead held on to their money and did not create more money. And they did that because they were afraid, because they started to rate liquidity as more important than profit. Are they behaving in a pro-cyclical manner now? Well, they certainly were during the Great Recession. After the financial crisis, banks definitely held on and made it much more difficult for people to borrow. Why was the Fed created and the FDIC? The Fed was created to try to stabilize this, but it didn't work because in the Depression, the Fed and the banks behaved in a pro-cyclical manner. The FDIC was created to help remove some of the fear about liquidity so that banks would actually be incentivized to seek profits more by making more loans. So it made it safer because the deposits were insured. All right, one more thing here about money. The monetary equation of exchange helps explain the relationship between the money supply and GDP. Money is on the left side and goods and services are on the right side. So P times Q is price level times real GDP. And price level times real GDP equals the size of M1, the money supply, times the velocity, which is the frequency with which each dollar bill is spent each year. So if the money supply is, say, 1 million and your GDP is 7 million, then you know that each dollar must be being spent 7 times during the year. So we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of this, but basically it helps us see if, for example, the money supply is growing faster than the output level. So if money supply is, say, growing at 2%, right, and the GDP is only growing by 1%, then we should expect the price level to go up, which means too quick of a growth in the money supply will result in inflation. Okay, and why did the banking crisis happen? I have linked on the Moodle site to a video called The Crisis of Credit that does a really good job of explaining this. So we will wrap up there for this week's lesson.